Joining me to discuss, we have our Chief Political Correspondent, Paul Sakkal. Welcome, Paul.
Hey, Jackie.
Hello. So what exactly happened inside the Albanese cabinet in the lead up to this decision to recognise Palestinian statehood? Because just a few weeks ago, like even 2 weeks ago, I think the PM was saying that the recognition was not imminent, and yet here we are. Has he got a different definition of imminence to us?
Politicians always have tricky language around what decisions have been made yet, what is not imminent, what they have plans to do or don't have plans to do. But I think this was a case that was less about him using tricky language and more about just a rapidly shifting global dynamic on this issue. You said a couple of weeks or a few weeks there in your intro. I think it was actually 11 days between the Prime Minister going on Insiders on a Sunday and his call with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, where he effectively, it was last Thursday night at about 7 o'clock, they had about approximately 40-minute call, which is quite long. And Albanese flagged his intent to the Israeli Prime Minister and said they were moving towards recognition sooner rather than later. They ended up making that call publicly on the Monday after the Thursday, so 2 weeks and 1 day after his Insiders appearance. And on that Insiders appearance, which was the same day as the French President Emmanuel Macron announced that he would try and lead the Western world into this pro-Palestinian push, our Prime Minister said that there were very strict red lines that he had around recognition. Any role for Hamas would not be contemplated, and he would not do anything that was symbolic or token or what would be perceived as a gesture. But that all moved very quickly.
Yeah, okay. I mean, some of his critics are saying, it's all for reasons of domestic politics, which seems like a strange criticism to me because, of course, the Prime Minister is going to be interested in domestic politics. That's kind of his job. But was that the primary, in your understanding, was that the primary motivator, or was it international forces like your Emmanuel Macron's who are basically saying, come and join this coalition and we'll try to end this conflict this way?
I think the international politics was what triggered the very hasty move into a public recognition of a Palestinian state over the last 2 weeks. You had France, you had Canada, you had the UK, all nearly back to back. They are the countries with whom we've moved in lockstep on our positioning on Palestine. And the view inside the government is that we're a middle power. We have very little role in Middle East politics, but we're also a respected voice. We're a respected voice in the Israeli political community. We're a respected voice in Southeast Asia, where there are some very large Muslim countries that have Muslim-majority countries that have close, very strong feelings about the Palestinian question. And we're a respected voice in international affairs. We often punch above our weight in diplomatic forums, fora. So the cover that was provided by those nations moving quickly on recognition meant that Albanese and his cabinet were able to fulfil the commitment that they had made in previous policy platforms of the Labor Party, and those commitments to recognise the Palestinian state at some point in the future were driven by domestic politics and internal Labor feeling on the Palestinian question. There's been, for about a decade now, huge internal grassroots push within Labor for them to take a stronger pro-Palestinian stance, and this movement from our like-minded nations allowed that to come to life.
I suppose the criticism is that the sort of strange thing is that it's not coming in response to any sort of moves in a positive direction from Palestinian authorities or towards any sort of outbreak of democracy or democratic institutions within Gaza and the West Bank, but it's more coming from the need seen by countries like Australia to put international pressure on Israel to end the conflict or make moves towards ending the conflict.
I think that's spot on. It's recognition in previous eras of thinking has not really been conceived of as a diplomatic tool to create change.
Yeah.
But because of Israel's increasingly unjustifiable war effort that has isolated it so dramatically, the balance has tipped away from them, from the Israeli view, and Western nations which have previously been allied to Israel and do still have friendly relations are so exasperated by what's going on that they have decided to use recognition as a tool to try and create change and potentially dissuade Israel from continuing, but also to persuade some of the Arab nations and the US to get involved and bring an end to this war.
What was the sort of political reaction to the decision at home?
It was all very stock standard. The opposition jumped back into its fervently pro-Israel position that characterised a lot of the politics under Peter Dutton.
To recognise unilaterally a Palestinian state does one thing for the terrorists. It rewards them and it emboldens them.
The sections of the media, particularly News Corp, quickly branded Anthony Albanese a friend of Hamas for making this decision. The tabloids in each of the cities, in the Courier Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun, the Addy, I think, all had very similar-looking splashes on whichever day the next day was, the Tuesday, all of them mentioning Hamas and how this was a win for them, which is obviously contested. And I think what was telling also was, to your question, Jackie, about whether this was driven by domestic politics, Labor backbenchers absolutely pumped this news out on their social media feeds on the Monday and Tuesday. You could see how much it was a pressure release valve for a lot of Labor MPs, particularly those on the left, who had spent months and months getting absolutely hammered by activists, but also increasingly non-activists who are fed up with what they're seeing on their TV screens and who believe that Labor hasn't quite done enough. So it was a pressure release valve for the Labor Party. It was met with a shrug of the shoulders from the hard left pro-Palestinian movement, who said this will do nothing on the ground, and who want to see more what they'd say is practical sanctions. The government says that it has no real power to sanction Israel anyway, and they would also be symbolic. So pretty expected reactions from across the political spectrum.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that about the backbenchers, and all these MPs are, particularly as you say, Labor MPs, getting a lot of mail on this subject. And Albanese, who's in an electorate that's very heavily sort of, the Greens are his main opposition in Grayndler in Sydney's inner west. I mean, it's a huge issue within that electorate. So he'd be feeling it at home as well. Totally,
and he's had to deal with protests outside his electorate office for long periods that have blocked his staff being able to go to work. And just on that question of MPs receiving mail, for a long time there's been this narrative that this is not within the top set of issues in the Australian electorate. And I think that a lot of weight can probably be put in that argument. But I heard an interesting view from Jerome Laxale, who's the member for Bennelong in Sydney's inner north. Many of our listeners would know that electorate well. And he said that this has been the number 1, 2 and 3 issue in his inbox for a long period of time. And I said to him, does that include kind of the inflation crisis and all other top-of-mind issues? And he said this is the biggest one. And it's not just activists. It's not just change.org bots. It's people in his electorate concerned. Yeah. I think once you get images of starving children on the television, people do tend to get upset. Coming back home to some of these pertinent to the domestic economy issues, next week, are you excited? Are you getting pumped? Have you got your outfits planned for Canberra Coachella? Have you booked your room? Because the Airbnbs are chockers. I might have to sleep on your couch. Of course, we're talking about the Productivity Summit, or Roundtable, if you will, which is happening next week. And we're getting a lot of mixed messages about it. In fact, if you're trying to, like me, you're trying to fashion a coherent narrative in the sort of lead up to this summit, it's almost impossible. Because on the one hand, Albanese is going, yes, we're open to big reform. We want to be a big reforming government, just kind of maybe not now. And they're pouring cold water on almost every idea that's come up in the lead up. What is the latest news? Can you cut through this all to tell us what's really going on? I do not blame you for not being able to form a coherent understanding of where this is all going. And the blame for that lies at the feet of the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, who haven't really been able to set a coherent message up in terms of what they are trying to solve and what the solutions are and what the trade-offs are inherent in those solutions. They talk a lot about the productivity challenge. Famously, we've talked about this in this podcast many times, that's a word that not many people understand. Yeah. So if you're trying to set up, get public sentiment to the place where they understand that there is a big problem that needs to be solved that affects their hip pocket, and that doing some of these big changes that might have losers on the tax side or the workplace relations side or anything else, to allow those people to understand that they are still worth pursuing because they make everyone better off overall, then critics have a fair argument, I think, at this point to say that the government hasn't been doing that kind of shaping of public opinion.
Well, maybe they're hoping that the productivity roundtable itself will do some of that work. We did on productivity, and as our friend of the podcast, Shane Wright, is fond of telling us, productivity is not about working harder, it's about working smarter. But productivity, we did get some productivity data this week that was sort of hidden amid the good news of the RBA cutting rates. What was that productivity number?
This is one of those moments where you think to yourself, why on earth would you be a politician? Jim Chalmers is just, I was just thinking about what his office would have been feeling at this moment. So he's just gone through an inflation crisis. Rates are finally coming down. He can claim a lot of credit for that and does. It's within the target rate band, and we're probably going to see some more interest rate cuts.
These interest rate cuts and the progress that we've made in our economy, they put us in good stead for the global uncertainty that surrounds us and for the big economic challenges which confront us as well. Inflation is...
And then Michelle Bullock the Reserve Bank governor, releases a statement saying rates are down, good news. Jim Chalmers hopes she does a press conference saying there'll be future rate cuts. People feel happy in their homes and pleased towards the government. And then bang, the RBA at that moment, at that same afternoon, decide to release their updated assumptions on what will happen to productivity over the next few years.
For the purposes of our forecast period, we think that the productivity assumption needs to be a bit lower. Interestingly, one of the reasons we've come to this position is that our forecasts were such that we were hitting our employment and our inflation forecasts, but we were overestimating our GDP and our consumption forecasts. So there was a tension in the forecast. Why were we hitting our targets when we weren't hitting? And part of the solution to that...
And they use those assumptions to do their forecasting around growth and rates and the trajectory for the economy, because all of those help flow into their decision-making around monetary policy. And this productivity assumption drops from 1% over the... I don't remember the number of years, over the next few years, to 0.7%, which has actually been closer to the average rate of productivity over the last 5 or 10 years. And those numbers seem very close to the lay observer. But if you had Shane Wright on here, and I'm sure he's raring to go ahead of next week's productivity roundtable, he'll tell you that that change in productivity in a yearly basis over a long period of time has a significant effect on economic growth, on living standards, on how much people's wages will rise, because it effectively means that we're not using our resources and our inputs as effectively as possible, and people will be, on average, poorer compared to the 1%. So Jim Chalmers sits there thinking, it's meant to be a fantastic day for me, and then the next day's headlines, page 1, I think, of The Australian, the Financial Review, and our paper, were all leading off on the double-edged nature of the news, being rate cut, yes, but worse productivity and pretty bad timing ahead of next week's roundtable.
You can always trust an econocrat to kind of come in and rain on everybody's parade. It looks now like housing and housing approvals are going to be a focus of the Productivity Summit, and you wrote about that this week. Tell us what's going on with housing approvals and how that can lift productivity.
Well, the government's done a lot of tamping down of expectation on areas such as tax reform, items like the capital gains tax, negative gearing, which we've heard so much about over the years, about how they are good reforms that, yes, create losers, but are still worthwhile. The government is doing a lot of backgrounding in the last week or so to say that those big items around tax and other contentious issues will not be the ones that are immediately solved at next week's roundtable. They might be set up for more work after the roundtable, after a debate is started and then pursued in future budgets. But next week, the agenda has been narrowed to red tape and excessive regulation and how to get the economy and key areas of supply moving more quickly. There is broad consensus across mining firms who want to build mines more quickly, among green energy firms who want to get solar and wind farms up more quickly than they currently are, and they are very slow, these approval processes, and construction firms who want to build housing. There's broad consensus, as well as inside the cabinet, that the environmental laws are clogging up the building of all of these types of items and causing us to move less quickly than we can on the green energy transition and to build far fewer houses than we need to. So there's a big effort behind the scenes to fix some of that.
Yeah. And I feel like the government's got a lot of skin in the game on the housing approval issue, particularly because they've promised to build so much housing.
Yeah.
And it is actually one thing where the opposition can very credibly say, you said that you had built, 10,000 homes and actually only one has been built. So it's something where the report card is very easily kind of tallied up. There's also road user charges, which is maybe not a sexy subject, but quite an interesting one because it sort of points to the difference, a transition, an economic transition and an environmental transition away from petrol cars.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a different word for them, but cars that use petrol and EVs.
Diesel combustion engines.
That's the one that I'm talking about. To me, cars are just red cars, blue cars, white cars, etc.
What car do you have?
I've got a dark blue, a midnight blue, and it uses petrol. So more and more people are taking up EVs. That's obviously an industry that will help us move towards the energy transition that we need to make. But that means that fuel excise goes down because fuel excise is essentially a tax on petrol. The fewer people using petrol, the less money the government collects in fuel excise. So what are they going to do to make up that revenue?
Well, they're moving towards a road user charge that will bring in EV drivers. Our proportion of EVs is still far fewer than some countries like China, which has moved much more quickly in that direction. There seems to be in Australia an attachment to using petrol cars. But we are moving more quickly in the last couple of years. A bigger and bigger proportion of cars being sold are EVs. And Jim Chalmers has been flagging this for quite a while, for years, really into the first term of his government. He was flagging work with the states to fix the fuel excise issue. In a similar vein, fuel excise, the tobacco excise is also facing huge black holes, and these are really critical because of the booming black market for tobacco.
Yeah,
so
that's
between
backfired.
fuel and tobacco, that they're actually key federal revenue sources, and over time, if those black holes continue to enlarge, that's a really bad thing for our budget. So there will be something on the road user charge at some point over the next few months, it looks like, and there'll be trials on which cars will be, which EVs will be dragged into it and at what point, but we're kind of yet to see the detail on that.
Yeah, okay. And on a more populist sort of note, there has been the prospect raised of a 4-day week. So the ACTU has made headlines about this. Business groups are very up in arms about it. It seems to me it's putting the cart a little bit before the horse, because don't you need productivity gains before you can drop back to 4 days a week? But I don't want to pour cold water on this. What has the government said about the prospect of a 4-day working week? Good things?
They're pretty cold on it.
Can I take tomorrow off?
Well, when they start printing just 4 newspapers in a week, maybe we can have a 4-day week too.
Let's not put the idea in their head.
The 4-day work week won't get much traction with orthodox economists, because one of the key benefits of productivity over time, when you can get your society working more efficiently, one of the byproducts of productivity is not just increased wages, it's actually increased leisure time.
Yeah.
And if you look over time, productivity grows, and so does the amount of time you get to spend at home with your family, or going to the footy, or writing books, or doing whatever else. So economists will laugh that idea out the door.
Okay. Well, I don't know. Maybe we can look to the robots to make up that fifth day for us, AI. The other thing that's again, speaking of populist appeal, there have been some reports of tension between Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers leading up to this summit. I don't know if this is just the work of hopeful journalists, hoping for some internal conflict that they can report on. Far be it from me to, suspect journalists of wanting conflict that they can then make headlines out of. But it does seem like Chalmers is a little bit more open to reform, particularly tax reform. Albanese seems to have a much more cautious and risk-averse approach. And they're coming from different directions, right? Like, they've got slightly different objectives, and they've got different personal interests and maybe even different political interests. So what's your take on the Albanese v. Chalmers beef?
Yeah, well, the starting point, I don't think it's a beef, so I'm going to disappoint listeners there. The starting point is what you've just said, that they do have different roles in the government.
Can we call it a stoush, a fight?
I think it's even more grey than that. There's something in the differences of there's something there in the difference of approach and the different intents they have and potentially how open they are to moving more quickly. But they have a pretty close working relationship. There's not been any overt public feuding between them, which is unlike Howard and Costello and unlike Hawke and Keating. Their feuds were much more clear. There's more nuance in this one, but I'm not suggesting there's no feud in at all. Fundamentally, Chalmers is hyper ambitious and eventually wants to become the Prime Minister. He can't say that at this point. The Prime Minister has just had a thumping election win, so he's pretty comfortable in his own shoes and doesn't need to worry as much about the rivals underneath him. Chalmers is interested in building his legacy as Treasurer by doing some big reform that marks him out as the replacement to the Prime Minister whenever that comes about. It might be much longer than people predicted before the last election, because why would he go anywhere given the resounding win he just had? And Albanese has made a core part of his leadership this sense of steadiness, this sense of putting an absolute premium on retaining the trust of the electorate by not doing more than he said. The lessons of the Rudd Gillard era are like branded into his skin. He was a key part of it, and he puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that when he amended the Stage 3 income tax cuts last election, which was a huge call for the government to make and was actually led by Chalmers internally, he stood up at the press club, admitted that he was changing course, and he tried to keep as much trust with the electorate as possible. So the idea that he would use a roundtable, as we're having next week, to radically alter the trajectory of the government and come up with a whole bunch of new tax ideas would be would run counter to everything that Albanese has said that he's for. But where the evidence of the feud has emerged is that the expectations for this roundtable and all of the big ideas that were being put up by experts and the opposition and independents and whoever else and interest groups got a bit too big on the government, and they were facing daily questions about the GST, about negative gearing, all these tough issues that they don't really intend to prosecute. And at each point when the expectations have been tamped down or an idea has been ruled out, such as the GST, the first mover to tamp down or to rule out has been the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And it's looked as if, at least in public, this may not be quite right. It might just be a more blunt rhetorical style from the Prime Minister. But it's looked like that Chalmers has followed him in step the next day by making the same ruling out points and doing the same expectations management. So that has created at least the kind of the public appearance of being slightly at odds. But I think it's a bit more complex than that.
Okay, maybe there's some complex mind games going on there that we can delve into in a future podcast. The Prime Minister was at pains to say this week that, he talks to the Treasurer almost every day. Just quickly, I want to check in on the opposition because we haven't heard so much from them. Yeah. So Susan Lee has been a little bit out and about this week, sort of talking about the round table and saying that, basically it's a foregone conclusion and, it's a charade. Do you think she's cutting through? How do you think she's going?
It's funny timing. I just had a call from one of her senior colleagues who was just calling to complain about what he believed to be the easy run we're giving Jim Chalmers. But the other point he made was that he doesn't even understand why we're quoting the opposition in news stories.
He doesn't understand why we're quoting.
Obviously, he wants to be quoted, but he said, we're just so irrelevant to the show at the moment. I don't even understand why you're asking us for comment. So that's a bit of an insight into how they're thinking.
Oh, dear. Okay. All right. Well, I think we can end there pretty much because I think that is quite a powerful statement in and of itself. But no, just quickly, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think Susan Lee has done well to not make any mistakes to this point. That's damning her with faint praise. She hasn't lost any skin by making a kind of overreach, which I think other opposition leaders in such a dire electoral position would have. She's being careful not to look as if she's brawling all the time. I think she's read the public mood pretty well.
Right.
And her team's key focus at the moment. There's a view in the opposition that in the first 6 months after that election drubbing, there's not really many votes to be won. Very little attention's been put on her. They're trying to get their internal processes around policy making, around how they approach media, around parliamentary tactics. They're trying to clear the decks from the Dutton era and become a coherent force that can set them up for more success later in the term.
Yeah.
And the word is that internally she's doing quite a solid job at all of that.
Okay.
So they're not a huge feature in public debate. They were probably never going to be. There's very little she can do to make the opposition super relevant right now. But
Yeah.
I think she's at least meeting minimum standards.
Maybe they should just all take 4-day weeks for a while. Paul, thank you as ever, and we will see you next week.
Thank you. Chat to you soon.